going, Master? For a drink.
Sorry about the mess.
You will never find a more wretched hive of scum and villainy. We must be cautious.
Jonathon Rinzler, welcome back to Rebel Force Radio.
Well, it's nice to be back. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, you know, I say back, but the reality is that you were actually on our previous podcast, going back to 2010. So it has been almost a decade since we've had an opportunity to talk to you, but it is wonderful to be back with you again.
Oh, that's amazing. 10 years. Wow.
Yeah, we had you on to talk about making of Empire Strikes Back. And then, of course, we met in person at Star Wars Celebration 2015 when we were hosting the behind-the-scenes stage, and you joined us there for a panel.
That I remember. Yeah, I think that was the last Star Wars celebration or convention, official one that I've been to. Yeah, that was a while ago too.
Well, I have to tell you, going back and reading your blog, that ended up being canceled or removed, however you want to describe it. I was blown away at the fact that, and you mentioned this in the very first blog post, is how your paths sort of crossed in weird ways with George Lucas. Your father was an editor at Rolling Stone magazine in California at the height of, you know, the counterculture movement, and had colleagues like Hunter S. Thompson, and just this incredible, you had this incredible seat at a time when the country was really shifting and changing. And as far as I know, that blog entry is the only time that at least I can recall that you've ever really chronicled that part of your life.
Yeah, there were a couple of blog entries where I talked a little bit about it. I don't know. I was just setting the stage basically, and it was kind of funny that our next door neighbor at one time was Ernest Callenbach, also known as Chick Callenbach, who founded the Film Quarterly, which is the magazine for UC Berkeley and for cinephiles. And so a lot of those Bay Area filmmakers used to just show up at his house, and they were probably just walking, you know, up the driveway, or not the driveway, but up the, you know, the path or whatever to the front door. And I was 10 or something. So I had no idea who they were, but then later would end up meeting many of them. So it was just kind of one of those weird things.
Yeah, no question. And of course, as time would go on, you know, then the dots would be connected. The possibility of who that might have been walking up that driveway. Now, were these up and coming filmmakers, were they approaching this guy because Chick, I believe his name, because they really wanted to get into his good graces because he was a well-respected authority on film, or do you think they were just getting together to geek out? What was it about him and that magazine?
Well, I think it was a small group of people who were just really passionate about film. So I think they were just getting together to talk about film and all of its aspects. There was no great. It wasn't like if you got your movie or your short into this magazine, your career was set. You know, had a small readership. It never had a huge readership, but it was, you know, there just weren't that many film magazines around back then, and he was the local magazine. And UC Berkeley, you know, had a certain amount of cachet even back in the 70s, and you know, he respected film, and it was just, they just were all around back then. Or maybe they weren't, but somehow our paths kept, or even I was living with my mother. My parents were divorced, and she rented out her room, a room that we had downstairs, to a woman named Terrell Seltzer, who ended up becoming a screenwriter and wrote a few scripts for Robert Zemeckis, one of which was produced, it was made into a film with George Clooney, and she was going out at that time with Wayne Wang. And they'd be in our house, at our house all the time. And Wayne Wang became one of the first, you know, really important and accomplished Chinese American film directors. You know, I think I think of his biggest film was Chang is Missing, I believe was the title, but I might be getting it slightly wrong. So the people were just around. Tom Luddy was going out with Alice, and I always forget if it's Miller or Walker, but the founder of Chez Panisse, which was down the road, and he co-founded the Telluride Film Festival, and he was friends with Coppola and Lucas and all those people. And I don't remember meeting him at the time, but much later, I had lunch with him across the street from Coppola's building in San Francisco with Lucy Wilson when we were starting up George Lucas Books. So it was like all these people were together in the mid 70s or 70s, and then I moved away for a long time and came back and then kind of reconnected with a lot of them, which was just kind of weird.
Right, and your father's career then took you to after his time with Rolling Stone, he got involved in the film business. And what I find interesting is that you're such a fan of film, yet you were also very close and you were seeing how the sausage was made. So I think it's interesting how you ended up such a fan and a chronicler of this stuff, but at the same time, since you were a teenager, understood the mechanics of the business and saw behind the scenes. And I think at one point even came face to face with Bruce the Shark. There was
I don't know for sure it was Bruce the Shark. It may or may not have been. It was definitely a big mechanical shark. It might have been just the one they're going to use in the Universal Studios tour that kind of lunges up at the tram. Or it might have been the original and they were just figuring out how it worked before they made that one. I just don't know. But it was quite I was so excited because, Jaws had changed my life along with like millions of other kids who saw it. So I just couldn't believe it was there on these two sawhorses. Yeah, so I was lucky enough to be able to just wander by myself around Universal Studios a couple of times. And there was no security. It was very lax. I mean, there was some, but it was, once you were in, you were kind of in.
Yeah. And do you find that with your unique upbringing, being around such powerfully creative people who, via your father, do you find being around all those individuals as a youth prepared you for eventually a career working directly with George Lucas on many projects?
I don't know. Maybe. I never really thought much about it. I mean, it's not like they were around all the time. They were writer. My father was basically an editor. He worked in the film business for a couple of years, and he had some connections. He was friends with Jack Nicholson, and he was friends with Bert Schneider, and a few other people. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess in a way, having one toe in that water, I met Karen Black, the actress, who was was a big actress in her day. So maybe it had prepared me in some small way for it. I don't know.
He's busy.
But you moved away from film. Well, actually, before we go there, I want to draw your attention to something that you wrote. You saw Star Wars in 1977, and I believe the story is you saw a preview of it. So you saw it before all of the United States saw it, and it became of course, a mega hit. And your impressions of it were that you really liked it, but then you go on to say that when Empire Strikes Back came out, despite how much you love Star Wars, Empire comes out and your brother kind of has to convince you to go see it.
Yeah, I just was not aware. I wasn't a Star Wars fan to the point where I was keeping track of what was going on next. I didn't even know they were doing a sequel. So because I think the general perception, I wasn't the only one, was that it was a film still for kids. And by that time I was graduating from high school. I was interested in other things, and it just wasn't on my radar. Whereas my brother, who was 4 years younger than me, it was really on his radar. He saw Star Wars, 4 years younger than me. I was 77. So I was 14. He was 11 or so. And he was like the perfect age to see it. So it had a bigger effect on him than me. But yeah, and then when I saw Return of the Jedi, I thought, well, that's it. With these Ewok, Star Wars is over for me. I can't take this seriously anymore. And that's really how I felt. I just thought, well, I mean, it's impressive as these visual effects were. I just thought these Ewoks, clearly I'm not the target audience anymore. You know.
Space teddy bears don't do it for you there, Jonathan?
No, I just thought this is pathetic, you know. But I've since changed my tune, but that's what I thought back in 1983.
You never would have had the courage to admit something like that to George Lucas when you were working with him, right? Like maybe on the making of Return of the Jedi book, you might have said something like, George, Ewoks, really?
Well, you know, let's see. I know if we had been talking about it, I would have said to him, you know, those Ewoks. I thought, yeah, I would have told him if it'd come up. My opinion in terms of the book itself, who cares? But there were plenty of, or at least a few significant people at ILM who also thought at the time that the Ewoks were really a possible problem, and were not crazy about them, including Ralph McQuarrie, you know, who wanted to make the Ewoks sort of more feral and more of a serious threat, you know, more obvious serious threat to the stormtroopers. But Lucas saw them differently, and of course he had his way. But yeah, and I reproduced them in the book. I forget who it was, but either Joe Johnston or one of the other storyboard artists showed a stormtrooper blowing the head off of an Ewok, and if people objected to the Ewoks back then, I put that quote in the book, you know, and George didn't have any problem. It's not like he crossed them out and said, no, everybody has to love Ewoks.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't like that. He knew he was fighting for something that people objected to from the get-go.
Well, George, I mean, famously wore a T-shirt that had, you know, some of the critical, you know, some of the nastier things that critics said about the Star Wars movie. He had that on a T-shirt, you know, movie with bad dialogue, blah blah blah. So he really shied away. The other thing that's interesting, though, is fast forward to 1999 and the last Star Wars film release. Before you became actually an employee at Lucasfilm was Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. And despite your distaste for Ewoks, you came away from that film, it sounds like, really loving it from the get-go. And I think, again, it was one that you saw early, and you talk about how there were those glorious, you know, couple of days before the whole backlash began about Jar Jar and everything else. What was it about Episode 1 then and still now that makes that film stand out to you?
Right. I was reviewing movies back then for GamePro magazine, the video game magazine. So I was able to get preview tickets and went with my daughter, who was about 10 or so kind of the same age as my brother way back when.
Great Star Wars age.
Sorry? Yeah.
Great age for Star Wars.
Right. And she came out and said, I can't believe it's already over. She was having so much fun. You know, she just wanted it to continue. And I saw it and I just loved it because for a number of reasons. I thought it was beautifully done. I was totally wrapped up in the story. I thought it was very interesting to show Darth Vader as a little kid. I thought that, because I'm interested in psychology and the importance of child rearing on what, you know, how it shapes us. So I thought that was a very interesting thing to do. I thought the Jedi battle, you know, the Obi-Wan versus, I thought Darth Maul was a great villain. And I thought it was very interesting how George teamed up two Jedi against the villain, knowing full well that that's not what you're supposed to do in a movie because it makes the villain seem more heroic. But then, of course, he separated them out.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's kind of like dressing the stormtroopers in white, you know, in Star Wars, which people forget was also a potential faux pas because the good guy was usually dressed in white.
Right.
And then the pod race was mind blowing, and the visual effects were mind blowing. And I thought Liam Neeson was fantastic as Qui-Gon Jinn. I just thought the whole thing was just so fun and interesting. And I really was just completely dumbfounded by, I think, a loud, you know, I don't know statistically what percentage of the audience they actually represented, but a very loud group who just really, really disliked it and were continuously vocal about it for about 10, 15 years. I love the Simpsons parody where they break into the Senate and they sit down and start having a debate. It's funny, but I think it's also just so, I just don't understand what's so horrible about showing the Senate and showing the what amounts to probably about 5 minutes of film time, debating what interesting philosophical or picking up some of the film's themes in the Senate. Why is that bad? They talked about the Senate in the first one. Why is it okay in the first one but not okay in the fourth one? Yeah. Granted, you don't see the Senate in the first one, but you know what I mean.
If you would have gone back and told all of us that were seeing those films as they were coming out, that hey, in another decade, you're going to see a movie, you're going to see the actual Galactic Senate, our heads would have come off. We'd have been so excited. George gives it to us, and we go, "What's this? What's this poly schlop?" Now, how did the prequels? Because Jimmy Mack points out a lot of times, and I totally agree. We think those films here at Rebel Force Radio, we think that those prequels are aging extraordinarily well. I think they are spectacular to look at, despite, no matter how many advances they make in home video presentation, they continue to hold up and look, I think, beautifully. But how did the prequel trilogy evolve for you, especially in light of the fact that after episode 1 came out, you started working for the company? I would assume that changed the way you were able to see the films and perceive them, right?
Sure. Yeah. Once you see, like you said earlier, how the sausage is made, it's hard to see the sausage, as pristine looking as you saw it before. Not that I saw terrible things, but particularly for episode 3, because I just saw practically every bit of it, as much as one person could see, right, more or less.
You wrote the book, episode 3, which I think I wore out the summer that movie came out.
Yeah, and it was 3 years of. It was different from any other book I wrote, because it was 3 years of basically being a fly on the wall, quite literally, and waiting for stuff to happen that might be interesting in the book.
Spent a lot of time on the set of episode 3. Without getting too down into your exact calendar and schedule of events, what can you share with us about your experience on the set there in Sydney, and what sort of scenes did you see getting shot?
Well, I was there for about a month, and so I saw scenes on Grievous's bridge being shot, the flagship, mostly Anakin and Obi-Wan trying, pilot the ship to the crash landing, and R2-D2 in the background. I saw part of Padme's funeral, because he just shot Natalie Portman just in the coffin section in Sydney. The crowd was shot later at ILM. I saw several scenes with the Emperor and Anakin. Oh God, what else did I see? It's funny because I also was at the pickups for 2 weeks in Shepperton, so it's hard for me to remember what was shot when. I was there, when all of a sudden they cleared, or at the end of the day, Rick Mccallum said, when we wrap the set, hang around, because just hang around. So I did, and suddenly Hayden Christensen showed up, but in the Darth Vader costume, and Ian McDermott came in with his more Emperor from episode 6 look, and they filmed that scene, or from episode 5. That's pickup for the Blu-ray cut or whatever it was for episode 5. So that was kind of mind-blowing. It was just me, Rick McCallum, George, and a couple crew, because George didn't want anybody to know they were shooting that scene or reshooting it.
For the re-edit of the Blu-ray, where it's Ian McDiarmid in there in place of the previous.
Right, in place of the person whose name I can never remember.
Clive.
Let me ask you this: when we look at that sequence now, in the special edition for Empire Strikes Back, or the Blu-ray release, whenever they actually did that. When we look at that scene, are we seeing Hayden Christensen as Darth Vader in that moment when he's kneeling and communicating?
Depends which shot, because I wasn't there in the editing when they put it together, but certainly he's in some of the shots. I would think maybe the shots from behind him looking at the Emperor, but I'm not 100% sure, because I don't, once they get an editorial, they can manipulate things, but I would think that, yeah, otherwise they wouldn't have gone through the trouble of putting him in the costume.
Yeah, I was only familiar with him shooting that final scene of Revenge of the Sith where he's on board the bridge of the Star Destroyer with the Emperor, and they're watching the Death Star being built. And that was the extent of Hayden's participation as Darth Vader, as far as I knew. But now I'm hearing you tell us that Hayden was actually in some of those sequences with the Emperor in Empire Strikes Back. That's really interesting.
Just that one, just that one scene where the Emperor is appearing as a hologram, and
Right.
he's saying we can turn. I think we can turn Luke, and then I was there for episode 3 when he's in the sort of Frankenstein's laboratory on the operating room, and he says no, that I was there for that. Everybody was excited that he was getting into the costume and stuff, and just lots of. I was there for lots of shooting Ewan McGregor on the back of the Boga, swinging his lightsaber around. A lot, just a lot of different scenes. They shot very quickly.
How did you get along with Rick Mccallum?
I got along well with him. He was the one who made it all happen. He was the one I pitched the idea of doing a real chronicle from day one to the end to, and he just on the spot said, okay, that's what we're going to do. And he made it all happen. I mean, I owe him everything. And I got along really well with him, basically till, right when the Clone Wars came around, he got pissed off at me basically for inserting myself into that other show. And I don't know if he was kind of annoyed at me for that, but we still spoke, and it's not like we were enemies or anything, but he was a little pissed off at me.
When you say that other show,
the Clone Wars,
the Clone Wars,
yeah.
Does that mean that you were less involved or thinking about the live action series that Rick Mccallum was working on at that time?
No. I was trying to evolve as a writer, and he helped me. He helped me tried to become a writer for the live action series, but that didn't work out. But for the Clone Wars, I just, instead of going through, I don't want to go into the whole politics, but basically I didn't obey sort of some of the hierarchy. I just sort of did my own thing, and it pissed off Rick, and probably, I can see his point of view. But anyway, he had his revenge, so to speak. So I think we were good at the end.
And how did he have revenge on you?
I don't want to go into it.
So
it was my own. I was hoisted by my own petard, let's say.
So you get through the prequels, and then the next big initiative for Lucasfilm is the Clone Wars. And what involvement did you end up having on the Clone Wars?
Well, I did a lot of books related to it because I did books as an editor.
Mm-hmm.
But then I was part of the writers team for season 4. So so for 2 weeks I was in the writers room pitching stuff like everybody else. George would come in with the basic ideas, but then as we broke each story, people could pitch whatever ideas they had. And then because it's a long story, but basically the 2 episodes that George wanted me to do, George thought basically here's fresh meat. So he said, you have to, what was the word he used? Rehabilitate Jar Jar Binks.
Well, hey, he found out that you loved episode 1. You didn't find Jar Jar particularly hateful, so he had his
I
had his man.
I thought Jar Jar was silly, but I thought the Ewoks were silly too. I didn't think it was any worse than that. In fact, I still think the Ewoks were worse. But anyway, yeah, he said, you have to rehabilitate Jar Jar. I ended up in a room at Big Rock Ranch with just George Lucas, Dave Filoni, and Christian Taylor, who was the head writer for that season. And so we broke down. He wanted to do kind of a Temple of Doom style Clone Wars show. So it was really, I mean, how great is that? How often do you have that kind of opportunity? Where you're basically at one point, you're so excited, you're like shouting your ideas. It's like you forget you're shouting to George Lucas because you just get excited, and you're like, oh, did I? Oh. I guess that's okay.
Jar Jar episodes, those showed up in the Lost Mission season 6 of the series, right. And that was a 2-parter featuring Jar Jar Binks and Mace Windu on an adventure. It was very good. I feel that Jar Jar Binks had already a few layers of redemption via the Clone Wars series in some of the episodes he was featured in, even before you got your hands on him in that season 6 episode. Why did George feel like Jar Jar still needed redemption all those years later?
Well, I think you're right. I mean, I think he did a number of shows with Jar Jar, and early on too. I think he just, for whatever reason, he just thought Jar Jar needed. He wanted to feature Jar Jar, and even though it already happened, he wanted. Speaking to me personally, it was like part of that rehabilitation program that George had put in place. But incidentally, I had pretty much nothing to do. There's almost virtually, I haven't hardly any of my script survived to the screen. I can't claim any credit for that episode.
Oh, you did get credit as a writer on the episode.
That would happen to anybody. They would credit the original writer, but by the time the director and everybody was done with it, there was hardly anything left of my script.
I remember when George got the big Disney honor. It's like their Hall of Fame equivalent. I think they call them like Disney Legends or something like that. And George did an interview surrounding that event, and they asked him who his favorite Star Wars character was, and he said Jar Jar Binks.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's funny.
On like that, is he trolling the interviewer, or is he really speaking from the heart when he makes a statement like that?
I think with George, it depends on who is interviewing him, what the context is, how the question is phrased, and other possible things like that. Because he's probably making a point. I created Jar Jar. I love my characters, and so given this platform, I'm going to say Jar Jar Binks. In another situation, he might have said somebody else.
I don't know. I think he was trolling a little bit. Do you find that George's reputation is accurate? Because people sometimes find him to be aloof or standoffish or demanding. Would you use any of those adjectives to describe the man?
Well, I mean, all those things are partially true. I was told when I was started that he was very shy, and I was never told not to approach him or anything like that. But I was, it was clear that I needed to give him, his space. And when I started going to the art department, there was an interview with him, an author was interviewing him, and I went and asked questions. So I mean, I talked to him occasionally, just like a few questions here and there. And there were a couple meetings and I was introduced to him. But when I was in a room with like the artist, the concept artist, I would, I was there just as a witness. So I never really had a long conversation with him till we were just him and me, just till we were on the set of episode 3. And he'd basically gotten used to me being around. It's personal chemistry. I know like Nilo Rodis Jamero got along just from the get-go really well with George. From the get-go, they'd go see movies together. George felt relaxed with him. Other people that George worked with on several films, he might have still had just a purely professional relationship with, and never really relaxed with him, he or she for whatever reason. No, it's not because he's the employer, he's the boss. There's all sorts of reasons for why it's difficult, and also he's not overly sentimental.
Yeah.
Once the film is done, that's it. He has his family and he has his friends, and he goes off and does his thing. But basically, though, overall, I'd say that he was just a really great person to work for, who really respected his employees and treated them well. I mean, better than 99% of the employers out there. And there were just so many perks from working there. I can't even begin to count them. It was just a great place to work. And and he had his faults, and nothing. No, he wasn't perfect, but he was incredibly creative.
What was it that the two of you, because I know you are a big fan of film and your books span not just Star Wars, but you get into Aliens and Planet of the Apes, by the way, which is on my list. I can't wait to read that. I've been wanting to pick that up. But your big books are so big, Jonathan, huge and expensive. But I can't wait to delve into that. Was that something that you and George, because he's, in addition to obviously being a filmmaker, he's such a student of film and loves films. Was that ever something that the two of you would converse about?
I mean, just movies in general?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Not that often, really. A few, maybe once or twice. We actually ended up talking about art more because he wanted to do all these Star Wars art books. And the first one was Visions, and he wanted me to get artists from all different branches of art, fine art, people who did historical paintings, people who did race car paintings. So we talked about art, because I used to be a painter and I studied art history. So we ended up talking more about art and even comic book art more than movies. I mean, I might be blanking. I'm sure we talked about movies some of the time, but yeah.
Something we kind of skipped over, if you could just briefly, how did you find yourself working for Lucasfilm? I know you were writing for a video game magazine, and you'd already been to France. We're trying the art thing, and film kind of called you back, and writing called you back. And but what was it about the opportunity to work at Lucasfilm, and how did that come about?
I just really wanted to work there. I came back to America, like you said, and I really wanted to work for a creative person. And George Lucas was quite literally in the neighborhood. I was living in Petaluma. Skywalker Ranch was about half an hour away, through the back roads.
And at that point,
I really,
it wasn't a Star Wars thing for you, right? It was about what Skywalker Ranch was created for, which was just this epicenter of creative people working in fine arts or in the arts and making film. So I just want to, the idea is that it wasn't, you didn't go there because, I love Star Wars. It was something else.
Right. It was, Star Wars is certainly a component. I mean, it was exciting because they were actually making Star Wars movies, but I was trying to work long before that. I had sent a resume and slides of my paintings to Industrial Light and Magic back in the late 80s. It was the idea of working for a really creative company, and I thought ILM was the most unbelievable place that I could imagine. There was that book that Tom Smith wrote about Industrial Light and Magic, which just blew my mind. Mm-hmm. And later I got to meet and actually become friends with Tom Smith, which was a kind of a dream come true for me. And so, I just wanted to work at a creative place. And that's what was so cool and so just a kind of dream come true, and beyond a dream come true, because once I was done with episode 3, I didn't know what was going to happen next. And it turned out that George just had all these ideas for books that he wanted to do. So I ended up working, and he loves books. So I ended up working one-on-one with him on a number of books, basically from 2005 till the moment he sold the company. Yeah. And so it was very unusual, and I'm just so grateful that it happened, and that and he made it happen.
Your making of books are so spectacular and so in depth, but we know that George's general statements about the Star Wars saga have kind of shifted over the years, and he's revised a lot of things he's had to say about the films. Did you find that his revisionist history of Star Wars sometimes provided certain difficulty when telling the story?
Telling the stories about the movies?
Yeah, and specifically his approach to them all. What I mean by his revisionist history is how he'll sometimes say that he wrote the entire prequel trilogy and original trilogy all at once. And then he decided he was going to just take the middle part because that was the most interesting part. But that really wasn't 100% truthful, because George, he wrote rough drafts of the original Star Wars, but didn't really establish a full story, a backstory for the prequels until it came time to actually write those films.
Right. Well, I mean, that's a big question. Part of it, I would agree with. The rough draft of Star Wars is really just Star Wars. It doesn't include prequel stuff in it. I mean, it does in some ways. It's like I always say, it's a kaleidoscope. There's parts of it that you can take out and say, yes, this became something in the prequels. But it was, at that point, it wasn't designated prequel. But on the other hand, George once said to me, I have this big notebook where I've written down all of my thoughts, my original thoughts on Star Wars. And when I would do these books, his assistant at his house would send me, photocopy pages of some things and send them to me. And so I get stuff from, whatever book I was working on. But I asked George, I said, well, can I see this notebook? Can I, this is your big notebook? And he just said, no. So I don't know what's in this notebook. It may be that he has that, thumbnail sketches of what the prequels are. So I really can't say for sure.
No one's ever really, other than George, no one's seen that notebook. But all of us fans, we know that it exists. We've seen, through your book and other things, we've seen snapshots of pages, but no one's ever rifled through the whole thing, apparently, other than George.
Exactly right. There would be legal notepad pages. Whoops. Hold on.
That's I can only imagine who's calling right now.
Sorry.
Say anything about the notebook.
I don't know how to turn this thing off. Can we just wait till it stops ringing? It'll stop in a couple of minutes. I have to have it here because I'm waiting for a doctor's call, but okay, that's good. It'll go to machine now. It exists somewhere. I mean, it definitely exists. I don't doubt that for a second. It exists. Some other author, or maybe George himself, will eventually write a book based on those notebooks, I'm sure. And then everything will have to be revised. I just hope that I'm close to the truth in what I wrote. But George never subjected the books that I wrote to revisionist history. And I made one mistake. It wasn't his fault. In the making of Star Wars, there's a thing it was the appendix, and it was like, okay, here's what George's original thoughts on C-3PO and Han Solo and those guys were, and he inserted midichlorians into that. But he wasn't trying to. He knew that he was doing it right in front of you. He wrote it on a piece of paper. I should have put the midichlorians in brackets. And it was my first archival book, and I just literally made an editorial mistake and didn't put midichlorians in brackets. So some people think that midichlorians are part of that original thoughts, and they weren't part of that document, that's for sure. And in subsequent printings, it does have brackets around it, so we corrected the error.
Well, thanks for that up.
Yeah,
because I really remember that part of the book, and you can't help but say to yourself, oh my God, he was developing the concept of midichlorians way back when. But in essence, he really wasn't. He just sort of threw that one in for the book, right?
Yeah, he was just trying to make it clear, or clearer, but he certainly wasn't trying to put one over on anybody, because I could have made whatever editorial mark I wanted to, and I just screwed it up.
Well, I want to fast forward a little bit, because you talk about from 2005 onward to the sale of the company. You were working with George. He had lots of ideas for books. You wrote many, many, many. There, by the way, most are all available at Amazon.com. You can look up and find J.W. Rinzler's listing there and check out all of his work. Was there ever a point that you started getting the feeling that George wanted out? Now, you do say that you sort of called it years before, saying, I bet someday if he sells to anybody, he's going to sell to Disney. But was there any point in working with him that you started getting a feeling that he was, perhaps getting tired or just wanting to move on?
Not frequently, but a few times, sure. And because it's something that he was trying to do since at least 1983 at the latest. I believe he wanted to retire. He considered retiring even after the first one because he didn't enjoy directing, and he was always trying to divest himself of things he didn't like doing. He wasn't all that crazy about running a company that was getting bigger and bigger, but some aspects of it he did like. But it's hard to imagine what it'd be like to run even a mid-sized company, and the pressure on him to keep, making some kind of product, to keep all these employees who are now counting on you for their jobs and their sustenance. That's a lot of pressure. I don't think I'd enjoy it. So he was, once when he came to the set of episode 3, I just happened to be standing a few feet away, and it was like early in the morning. He was just sort of hung his head and he said, why am I putting myself through this? Later when we were doing the visual effects, he was like, yeah, now before you guys were beating me to get you what you needed to make your effects. Now I get to beat you because you have to finish the visual effects.
Right.
So he was always conscious of, this kind of drudgery aspect of his job.
Mm-hmm.
And so I always thought he wanted to get rid of the company eventually. I didn't know. I thought maybe one of his kids might want to do it, but I thought if they didn't, Disney was the most likely place because they have the deep pockets and they have the best track record of keeping characters alive for decade after decade after decade. So I just thought it was a natural choice for him. I just thought it would happen 10 years later than it did. I was totally surprised.
You're working at Lucasfilm. You get the same email as everybody else does on that fateful day. George writing an email to the company saying that he just sold the company to Disney. He and Bob Iger worked out the deal. And was it that same day, or was it the next day, or sometime after that you all went to that warehouse there and heard from him personally?
It was the same day. We got back from lunch. It was around 1:30, and basically an hour later or 2 hours later, we were the whole company, because we couldn't all fit in the auditorium they have at San Francisco. So they rented this big building over in Point Richmond, ironically near where Pixar used to be located, and Pixar, of course, was spun off from Lucasfilm. But yeah, so that it was the same afternoon, and several people came on stage, including Kathleen Kennedy, to talk about what was happening, and it was basically George's farewell to the company. So it was pretty emotional.
What was the general vibe like among your colleagues when all this was going down? Was there trepidation? Was there excitement? How were people feeling?
I think you had the whole spectrum, from fear to excitement. I think some people were worried about their jobs, obviously. Some people, like people in licensing, were from the get-go worried that we'd all be moved south because we knew that Disney's licensing company was down south. And then there was excitement because Disney had, in the beginning we thought Disney had huge potential. So, and that's still true.
Didn't George announce to the company about a month prior to selling it, to announcing he was going to sell it? Didn't he let everyone know that he was going to fire up the machine again and start producing more Star Wars films?
That's a good question. I'd have to go look at the calendar. It's possible. I think it's possible that already the sequels uh, were known to be happening. I can't remember but that's I think that's right. But I have to go back and look at the calendar. Yeah.
Did the hire of Kathleen Kennedy, was that writing on the wall at all to you, Jonathan, when you saw him step down as CEO and install Kathleen? Was that further proof to you that he was on his way out, or did you think he just wanted to focus on the creative aspects of things at that point?
To me, hiring Kathleen Kennedy was proof that he wanted to do more, because he was getting Rick Mccallum was leaving, and she was coming in. So for me, it was a sign that he was, going to continue to make movies and TV shows, because obviously she is a big player in Hollywood.
Why did Rick want to leave Mccallum? I was surprised by that, because he was still involved with George on working on producing the live action Star Wars show. Maybe by this point in time, George had realized that he was going to put it on the back burner. But what was the thing that drove Rick Mccallum away from Lucasfilm?
You'd have to ask Rick. I honestly don't know. I do know that one of the things that was driving George crazy, and again, I'd have to look at the calendar, but he was trying to build this studio in Marin County. It was going to be Skywalker Ranch C, right? Skywalker Ranch Part A was Skywalker Ranch, Part B was Big Rock Ranch, and Part C was all the same property. He wanted to create a kind of TV studio where he could do the live action show, and I can't remember when, but it had to be before, because I know it was one of the elements that most likely contributed to his decision to sell the company, was that Marin County wasn't going to allow him to build this studio, because neighbors were protesting and there were going to be lawsuits, and he just didn't want to deal with it. That might have something to do with it.
Oh, I'm sorry, Jonathan. Please continue.
No, that was it.
I've heard a lot of fans say that George sold Star Wars because he didn't want to listen to any more criticism from fans. And that's the reason why he sold it. But I think that when you connect the dots, you'll see that when Grady Ranch fell through and Marin would not allow him to build his studio there, that's really what started to push George out the door and say, I'm just going to sell this company.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah, because I think it's unfair for people to place the blame at the feet of Star Wars fans for why George retired. I think there were several different facets to his retirement.
I completely agree. Yeah. Also, he's getting old. I mean, he was in his early 70s. He had to start planning how to his exit strategy, basically. I can, yeah, there were many reasons, and I really don't think fan opinions about the prequels had much to do with it. If you'd have to ask George, but I would doubt that it had too much to do with it. Plus, the Clone Wars, did 5 seasons. It's not like they were a disaster or anything.
Right?
They did pretty well.
The Clone Wars were really one of the first casualties after the Disney acquisition. Can you talk a little bit about the culture shift that happened in the company? Was you categorize it as being a quick change? Was it very gradual, or how did it unfold for someone who had been there, at that point over a decade?
Yeah, well, it depended which department you were in. Certainly, I was in the publishing department, which was actually when we were separated out from licensing and became part of Disney Publishing, which was still a part of their licensing. So it really depends, and I have to be careful, right? Because as you guys know, Disney has a very wide definition of their NDA, and I have a much narrower definition of an NDA. But I just don't feel like dealing with lawyers calling me up.
Understood.
But basically, yeah, there was Sorry?
Do the lawyers call you often?
No.
Okay,
But
good.
let's just say I have heard from at least one lawyer, let's say,
Yeah.
as I've said elsewhere. But so yeah, I mean, it's two different companies. So yeah, there was for me anyway, just in my opinion, there was a slow culture change, and basically, just in terms of myself, my autonomy was just slowly eroded to pretty much almost nothing.
Oh, well, that's
Mhm.
terrible.
So I had to get the hell out of there.
I understand now, because your roster of books that you created during your time working with George and Lucasfilm is so impressive that I have to admit it was shocking when we learned you had left the company, and that was in the wake of The Force Awakens, the making of the Force Awakens book being shelved. I guess that was never released, was it?
No, it was never released, and I had already quit before they asked me to kind of add stuff to what Mark Vaz had already written, and so it wasn't like they canceled the book and then I quit. I had already said I gave them 3 months notice, and so I was already out the door. But yeah, in terms of what I had done there, they, frankly, in my opinion, Disney could not have cared less.
Well, I'll tell you the big disappointment for me, and I think a lot of fans, we've talked a lot about it on this show, is as Star Wars fans, we were so accustomed to having every detail, down to your books, every detail of the production, the good, the bad, the ugly, the sandstorms, the all of the things that went into making those films. We all know the stories.
Spoiled.
We're so
very
spoiled. We know the stories by heart. In comes episode 7, Harrison Ford injured, J.J. Abrams and the release date switching, and all of these things that makes for such great behind-the-scenes drama. And we feel like the story will never be told. Do you think that those stories behind these sequel films and Solo and Rogue One, do you think those stories will ever be told?
I would, well, ever. Somebody might write it. Somebody who's outside of Disney. Because I always say, just so I don't want people to think there was anything that exciting in The Force Awakens. There wasn't. It was a licensed book in the heart of Disney. I wasn't dishing any dirt that wasn't already public knowledge.
Right.
Like you guys already said, 2 or 3, So it just told the whole story in chronological order, and so there wasn't anything revelatory in it. But I assume actually that somebody outside of Disney will, because nothing's stopping them. You don't have to. You just won't have any photos. But there's nothing preventing somebody a journalist from writing like basically a history of from when George sold the company to whenever they decide to the end of their book. I imagine a book like that will come out eventually.
Did you read Bob Iger's book by chance?
No. I just read an article about it. Quote about. Did you read it? What?
Well, you read most of it. Listened to the audiobook, and it's just it's fascinating how he describes George's involvement and how that devolved into little to no involvement versus some of the things that George has said publicly on, with whether it would be who was the
60 Minutes.
60 Minutes, yes, and
Charlie Rose.
Yeah, that was the big one, Charlie Rose.
And it's the clash of these these titans, these two major players in entertainment. But on the one hand, it's like you had a real corporate shark with lots of experience going up against a guy who, great filmmaker, super visionary, but was maybe a little naive in some sense going up against such big corporate powerhouses.
Yeah, I don't think George is naive, but I don't know what he really thought was going to happen. Um, again, you'd have to ask him.
Just from your own point of view, was there a world where George Lucas could have played a more significant role in the development of the sequel films, or is your experience with George such that it's George's way or the highway, that he would not have been able to collaborate on something like that? Just your
I would say that certainly it's conceivable. Yes, they you could have found a way. I mean, I just wrote with Howard Kazanjian, his memoirs. It's not, I interviewed other people, um, but I spoke with Howard at length about this, and I've spoken with other people who've worked closely with George, and we all sort of agreed that if you're going to work closely with George, you have to speak George. It's like a specific language, a specific way of doing things, and it changes subtly according to whatever that person's relationship is with George. But you have to know how to work with him, and some people get it right away. It took me a while to learn. I almost was fired a couple times by George. When we were working on the book Frames, at one point we did an early test, and the pages, the reproductions, they were, in the deluxe version, they're like, we're blowing up film frames that are this big to this big, and I wasn't communicating why it was so hard to do that. Printing is different from projecting. And we did this test, and it wasn't very successful. But I hadn't been responsible for the test because it's a long story. But basically, at a certain moment, it didn't matter. And George said, "Look," because I said, it's not my." George was upset, and I said, "This isn't. I didn't order this test. I don't even know who this company is." And he said, "I don't care. I'm talking to you." And that's when I realized, right, I'm going to have to up my game. As far as he's concerned, I'm doing this book with him. He doesn't see anybody else. I have to have total control over this project, or I'm going to be fired. And so I had to move things around in publishing and make sure that I was really on top of every tiny little thing. And that was an important step in that learning curve of how to work with him. So yeah, I think so the right combination of people could certainly have worked with George, and Dave Filoni, I think, is somebody who clearly could do something like that.
Or Jon Favreau.
Yeah, I don't know John. I've never been in a room with John, but I was with Dave Filoni for the whole season 4, and clearly he and George get along really well, and obviously Dave has a lot of respect for George, but George also had respect for Dave.
Yeah.
I had heard a story about the Star Wars Frames books, that when George opened up, and this may be the test run that came close to getting you fired, but George opened up a book and a bunch of pages fell out. They just fell out of the book and landed on the floor.
That may be true, but he wasn't looking at a finished book. He was looking at a certain point. We gave him page proofs, so they weren't bound. So that would be normal.
Completed book that was returned by the publisher and the binding didn't really work out. But
it wasn't that. There were problems with some of the final books, but that wasn't something that George saw. But yeah, there was another problem. I mean, I don't want to bore you guys, but yeah, another problem where it really was completely my fault, and I thought I was fired. So
on the same book, or on a different book?
On the same book. Yeah.
Oh, what a pain in the ass that book was for you, Jonathan.
Oh yeah, that book was very hard. It took 5 years to do that book.
God.
And I still maintain it was the most expensive book ever made in the history of bookmaking.
This is true. So what is it that you did in that instance that almost got you fired?
I mean, it's going to take a while to explain. You guys really want to know?
Well, if we have to get too deep in the weeds, then maybe
it's hard to explain. The short version is, the short version is, I should have anticipated a problem where there then was a problem. I was tired because it was 5 years, and I thought this won't be a problem, and it turned out to be a problem, and it was basically a mistake that I made, and we had to redo a bunch of stuff, and it cost money, and so I thought, well, that's it. I'm definitely fired. And George had called me up and was clearly pissed off. It was the most pissed he'd ever been with me, and but I went. I think it was the next day. I assumed I was fired, and I went to go see the head of licensing. He said, "Well, don't assume that till you actually see George." And I went to go see him the next day, and by the time and that was in his office at Skywalker, because he had called me. I was in San Francisco, and he was like, "It's not that bad. In fact, it's only a certain number of pages I want redone, but it did cost a lot of money, even though it was only a few pages, because of the screw up that I'd basically made." This interview was sounding like a series of screw ups for me.
No, not at all. It's not often that we get we're privy to such an inside look, and thank you for being so open. The blog that you started got a lot of us excited. We thought we were going to really get the story behind the story, and as you say, other entities get involved and NDAs get interpreted in certain ways, and so there goes away the blog. But looking back now, and you look at the Star Wars sequel trilogy, The Mandalorian, and some of the television projects that are on the horizon, the fan inside of you, the guy that loves the characters and the stories that George Lucas created, how do you see the future of Star Wars and the present, for that matter?
Well, I've said many times when asked something like that, it's kind of like the James Bond franchise now. There'll be ups and downs. There'll be some directors who do a good job. Some directors won't do that great. There'll be some great scripts, not so great scripts. It's just going to go up and down. I personally, I think I don't know if you guys care, but I haven't seen any of the movies after Rogue One. I just stopped seeing them, and I haven't seen The Mandalorian, so I don't really have an opinion about any of those.
There's no level of curiosity. I mean, there's so much talk about these films all the time that it must come across your desk every once in a while. Wow, people are saying this about The Last Jedi. People are saying this about The Rise of Skywalker. There's not just a little part of you that's curious?
Really, no. I have a couple of friends who tell me that what I need to know, they go see it, and I say, well, what do you think? And I trust their opinions. Nobody has said to me, oh, you really ought to see this one. And that doesn't mean that some people love them, right? Some people love them more than the original trilogy, which is fine. I don't want to rain on anybody's parade. But for me, George Lucas was a particular artist. Star Wars is not an adaptation of somebody else's book, for example. He wrote Star Wars. He wrote it, he directed it, he edited it. They're his creation. So unless somebody of a similar stature is going to do their Star Wars movie, it's just not very interesting to me. It's like if you like Van Gogh's paintings, but then somebody comes up and says, well, I'm going to paint something in the style of Van Gogh, but it's just somebody who hasn't really studied Van Gogh.
Wow.
Then why would you care about that person's paintings?
That's a really great analogy. I like that. You've articulated it in a way that it kind of helps me with some of the feelings that that I have as a fan. But there is a particular aesthetic. A lot of times we'll say things like, Star Wars is so unique, it's hard to explain. Some people get it, they get it right, or they get it closer to where George was, and then some people are, really, really off the mark.
Jonathan, is there a director out there today that you think might would be a good fit for Star Wars? Is there someone out there that you would like to see take a shot at it?
I'd love to see Steven Spielberg do it. That would be fun. I would love to see Guillermo del Toro do it. That would be fun. I mean, I'd go see that. I'd love to. Joe Johnston
Yes.
did a Star Wars movie. I mean, there's a guy who, Rick Mccallum was once screaming at me in his office that Joe Johnston, after George was, the person most responsible for Star Wars success. And he's just there. He's just down the street from Disney,
Yeah.
I'm sure there's David Fincher. Why not David Fincher? Let him do a Star Wars movie.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
What do you think of a Taika Waititi?
Sorry?
What do you think of a Taika Waititi as a director for a Star Wars film? Are you familiar with Taika's work?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
It's okay, because a lot of us have thought, where is the Steven Spielberg Star Wars movie? Where is the, Guillermo del Toro and et cetera? But it doesn't seem to be the pedigree that they're looking for right now.
They like the young, quirky auteur to come in there and unravel everything. So, but hopefully they're moving away from that kind of thing. Do you see? There's a lot of rumors flying around, and I know you don't have any particular inside scoop or anything, but just, someone with your experience and knowledge, I was wondering if you think Kathleen Kennedy is going to be sticking around with Lucasfilm for a long time, or do you think she might already have a foot out the door? There are so many rumors out there.
I don't know. Some people have told me about the rumors, but I don't, I don't know anything, and I'd rather not speculate. Mm-hmm. I just rather not speculate.
Right.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Your new book, All Up, and if Jimmy wasn't here, I would be asking all kinds of Planet of the Apes questions, but this is not a Planet of the Apes podcast. I'm dying to talk to you about apes, but
Jonathan's also a big Jaws aficionado too, outside of seeing that mechanical shark.
Oh, all right. I didn't realize that.
Yes, Jonathan's written extensively about Jaws, haven't you?
Well, I did a thing called the Jaws blog, kind of, homage to Jaws, the Jaws log, where it's just an analysis of the film. It's on my website. I just did it for fun. I just love that movie so much. I don't do those analyses. I've only really done a couple, Unforgiven and Jaws. But if you want to see it, it's on my website.
And then the website is, can you?
jwrinzler.com.
Check that. By the way, I just showed my daughter, she's 11 years old. I just showed her Jaws for the first time. And she held up real well until, that head, when they find that head at the one, right, that was a lot for her. And then Quint's death. I had forgotten when I've seen it on TV so much. I forgot how grisly his demise is.
It was truly horrifying. Truly horrifying.
It really is. And I had also, because she likes to go and search YouTube then for making ofs and stuff like that. And it was interesting to find out that Robert Shaw helped rewrite parts of that, of his dialogue, in particular his monologue that he has there about the Indianapolis. That helped.
There's a great book about Jaws. Of course, there's the Jaws log, which is one of the great making of books of all time. But then there's also a Martha's Vineyard, or Jaws Memory, or Jaws Memories of Martha's Vineyard by Matt Taylor. If you guys haven't read that and you like Jaws, this is a guy who lives in Martha's Vineyard, knows all the locals, like all these stories that you've never heard before. Just really insightful behind the scenes stuff. It's one of the best making of books I've ever read. I always plug it whenever I get a chance.
Cool. Have you checked out Wondery's Inside Jaws podcast?
Sorry?
It's fascinating. It's a podcast called Inside Jaws. It's absolutely fabulous. You should check it out.
Okay, yeah. I was on some Jaws podcast with the author of that book. but I don't. Bad. I don't remember the title of the name of the podcast, but it was really long. It was like a 3-hour podcast.
Ooh, yeah.
Well, let's talk about All Up, which is your latest book. And is this your first stab at publishing a fiction story?
Yeah, more or less. I wrote a licensed Indiana Jones YA novel, which was actually a lot of fun. But I wrote that in 6 weeks. This other book was the passion project of my life, I'd say. It took 7 years of research and writing, and it was a labor of love. And it's just a historical fiction thriller about the first space age. It goes over. It concentrates on basically the German Werner von Braun, who was the architect of the V2 and sort of smuggled to America in Operation Paperclip and sort of heads up ultimately the Saturn V program. And then in Soviet Union, there's Sergei Korolev, who is his sort of counterpart, who's launches Sputnik and the first man in space and the first woman in space and the first 2 men in space. I mean, Soviet Union did all these firsts, and people know the broad strokes, but they don't know the details. Mm-hmm. And the details are absolutely fascinating. I mean, just huge.
Does it go into an alternate reality, Jonathon, or is it it's strictly historical fiction?
Some people, it's kind of bothersome because people keep saying it's like the word alternate history is so common these days, and it's not alternate history. This book is what happens factually with a few twists, like literally count them on one hand twists, but nothing that changes history in any way. But what it does do is it brings in things that you can't do in an official history, which those guys were completely conscious of. UFOs, flying disc problems, Foo Fighters, things. Hermann Oberth was one of the Germans responsible for a lot of the breakthroughs, a mathematician, didn't have any doubt about UFOs existing. They existed. He had theories about where they came from and everything. And their goal was, not to go to the moon. These guys, their goal was to go to Mars. Yeah. In a sense, we're still kind of traveling in their footsteps. They totally intended to go to Mars, and they weren't sure if they might find, some kind of alien species on Mars.
It's fascinating here in the United States how the kimono is starting to open up on UFOs to the point where they don't even call them UFOs anymore. I think it's UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena. And it seems like it's being done to change the stigma of those that believe. So
I tell you, anybody who spends, does any research at all, who reads the book Disclosure or Abduction by John Mack or any of the Nick Pope books that just catalog all the professionals who have seen UFOs or whatever you want to call them, flying discs, whatever they are, there's no question about whether they exist or not. They're out there. What they're doing, where they come from, all that stuff is up. I have no idea. But those guys they weren't stupid. They knew what was going on. In all the countries, they had all the leaders of the world, starting in the 30s, were highly aware of that stuff. They had to be. Their power base, was in jeopardy. And also there was, who were they? Are these friends or enemies? Can we make a ship like this? These are the standard questions they ask themselves. And there's a book called The Day After Roswell by Philip Corso that goes into a lot of this. There's astronauts who have come forward. They're generally not supposed to do that, but several astronauts have said they've sighted weird things out there.
Members of the Apollo crews have all said it. So your book really kind of it shows that the space race really began in the 40s in World War II. That's the beginning of it.
Right.
It's President Kennedy is the one that really sort of galvanizes the public, their support for the space program. Up to that point, I don't think there was really much interest by the general public in the United States.
Well, actually, that's what the book goes into, is actually von Braun, who is, a Faustian figure, very controversial figure, because they were using slave labor to build the V2s in Nazi Germany, and there somewhere between 10 and 80,000 slave laborers died in the effort. So I mean, we're talking, crimes against humanity stuff. But he was the one who went out and did these articles with others from his, in his group, or Collier's Magazine. It was Collier's Magazine series of articles that really, plus the UFO sightings, which was a big deal. For a while, UFO sightings were like all over the world. Everybody was talking about it, and then it kind of the so-called whatever Iron Curtain came down in the mid '50s, and then it became, anybody who talked about it was a wacko.
Right.
Especially but for a while, it was normal.
Like the Soviet government was a little bit less precious about it, and they were a little bit more open. But certainly, the United States, it was everybody was branded a kook, a wacko, a nut. Everybody was some hayseed from the deep south, or lived on a trailer park somewhere. Just completely discrediting anyone that saw this stuff. The book sounds really fascinating. Is there an audio book, by the way, of it?
They're recording it now, so I'm happy to say that it was, chosen to be an audiobook.
Right.
Which is great, because I know a lot of people like to listen rather, because they're busy or whatever. Yeah, so hopefully in a month or so, an audiobook will be out.
And do you get any say as to who the narrator is as the author? Do they send you tapes?
They sent me, it's a guy named Paul Woodson, and they sent me, I don't think I really had approval or not, but they sent me a chapter which he read, and I thought it was fantastic. So I mean, I'm really thrilled that he's doing it.
Well, you have a great voice, so maybe you could narrate one of your books. But all of it is available at Amazon.com, and anywhere books are sold. I'm going to definitely pick up that as soon as it hits Audible. I'll be picking that up to listen to it, because I love historical fiction, and you hooked me at UFOs and crazy Nazi scientists and the space race. So, I mean, that's some of my favorite things right there. I did want to ask, there was a book that I saw that was supposed to be coming out in August this month, and the page, it just left me. And I'm wondering if it's actually, do you have another book that's coming out? This was
The Making of Aliens with an S.
Right, The Making of Aliens. So that is still on its way?
Yeah. It was delayed by 6 months because of the pandemic, but now it's coming out at the end of August. Yeah.
Great flick. I saw that one at the Twin Drive-In back in 1986, and that was a thrill-a-minute flick. I can't even believe it. Jim Cameron was amazing with that material, and so intense. As the aliens are stalking the astronauts through the ship and everything. Oh God, I flash back to that night at the drive-in all those years ago. Anytime anyone mentions aliens with an S.
Yeah, there it is. The Making of Aliens. J.W. Rinzler, coming out on August 25th. So next week. Congratulations on that. Also,
did you work with Jim Cameron on that book at all? Did you interview him?
I'm sad to say no. I did not talk. He was too busy on Avatar 2. I was told he was not available. But I did talk to a number of other people, and it's a pretty interesting story. I'd say a very interesting story, and yeah, I loved that movie. Was quite a ride. I remember seeing it for the first time too. It was fantastic.
Amazing. So we'll look forward to that, Making of Aliens.
Is there a movie out there, Jonathon, that is calling you and saying, yeah, this story really needs told, the making of this film? Do you have a list? Do you keep a list of these?
I maybe in my head, but yeah, the movie that I would love to write about, and I've contacted the Hitchcock estate, or I've tried to contact them 3 times now. I just can't seem to get an answer. I've tried people I thought might be able to contact them, but I can't. But I'd love to do a North by Northwest.
Ooh, what a great
Yeah, it's like the first James Bond film. Sorry, you cut out there.
Oh no, that's the second time you mentioned James Bond. What about a James Bond book, or is everything that needs to be said already been said about Bond?
Well, I haven't done the research, but there's been so much James Bond stuff, and Taschen did a great James Bond book a few years ago about all the Bond films. You know, I'm sure if somebody said, "Hey, you can do Doctor No, and here's a whole bunch of files," I wouldn't say no. I definitely wouldn't say no. But
are you looking forward to No Time to Die? Do you think we'll see it in November?
I'm looking forward to it. I will go see every James Bond movie, no matter what. It's different. You know, some of them are awful, some of them are good, but yeah, I'll go see it.
Yeah, I'm hoping that get it in November. We'll see.
Yeah, and I'm hoping they can open cinemas in a responsible way pretty soon, because I really miss going to the movies.
Well, the AMC theater chain is reopening this week, so we're taking one step closer.
Yeah, do you guys live in an area where you'll be able to go to AMC?
Oh yeah, I'm surrounded by them.
Yeah,
oh, fantastic.
Chicago area, they're everywhere. But I don't know if I'm going to be heading back to the theaters anytime soon. They really need, like, a Bond movie would get me. That would get my seat back in a theater.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
Jonathon, you have been beyond generous with your time. We could sit and talk to you all night. His blog, The Rise and Fall of Star Wars, let's just put it this way: if you look hard enough online, you can find it. It still exists out there. Nothing dies on the internet, but go to jwrinzler.com, the website. Check him out on Amazon. He's just, if you're a film fan, a genre film fan, he's got a book for you. And I say that the definitive making of books are Jonathon's making of Star Wars, Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi. They're fabulous. If you can't, because the hardbacks are really expensive now. But I love the digital versions that came out, because there's audio files and video files embedded in them, and they're super well done. So if you can't get the hardback, the digital is a great way to go.
Jonathon, do you have a Star Wars book project that stands out as your favorite?
Star Wars book project. I mean, I
Star Wars sound that you did, the incredible book about the sound effects of Star Wars, with the foreword from Ben Burt, and the little playback machine on there where you can press a button and hear the actual sound effects.
Yeah, I enjoy doing that book. It's really Ben Burt's book. I just sat there and asked Ben, so what about this sound? And his memory is so sharp. He remembers everything, and it's just, it's a question of recording his answers and turning it into a book. And Ben, I always say there should be an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, or San Francisco, or LA, or all three places, and where they just demonstrate the artistry of his sound design, because they're like tone poems. I mean, they are truly incredible. It's an art form. They need to recognize that art form, before that generation passes away. Walter Murch and a lot of those guys are just. That was part of the joy of working at Skywalker Ranch, was being up the little road from Skywalker Sound. I mean, it was unbelievable. Matthew Woods, and fantastic. But yeah, for me, to answer your question, I think the Episode 3 book, as a book, it's not that, we didn't get to do the expensive sort of big coffee table version I wanted to do. We couldn't convince the publisher that made any sense. But in terms of, it has to be my favorite, because it was just such an unbelievable experience, doing that and getting to witness all of that. Yeah.
Well, I devoured every word of that, and back when those books weren't, as commonplace. It was great to get that perspective on the making of that film, and great to get your perspective tonight. And anytime there's anything you want to talk to us about, or Star Wars fans about, you're always welcome here on Rebel Force Radio.
Oh, thank you. I'm sure we'll have occasion to talk again.
I look forward to it. All right.
Okay.
We'll keep reading your book, so if any questions pop up, we shall alert you and let you. So thank you so much, J.W. Rinzler, Jonathon Rinzler. It's such a pleasure to get caught up with you. Everyone, check out Jonathon's books, and all other information can be found at jwrinzler.com. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Certainly.
Take care.